So basically, we've spoken of the developmental trajectory, but what is the neuropsychological basis of this pattern? So, why is it, for instance, that adolescents normally engage in some kind of deviant behavior, right? So, we've already discussed time and again that adolescence is the time of experimentation. It is the time when uh, people are extremely susceptible to peer pressure. They are high on risk taking. But why is it that it happens? Why is it that during adolescent years, teenagers are susceptible to some kind of deviancy in behavior, usually minor deviations in behavior? And that essentially is because of how our brain develops, and that's the neuropsychological basis to it. So our brain essentially different parts of the brain or different networks of the brain develop in a differential manner. And from the perspective of deviant behavior, we recognize two such areas. The first one is the cognitive control system. So this is not just one particular area of the brain; it's a combination or a network of multiple areas. So the first such area is set of areas is the cognitive control system, which predominantly consists of the prefrontal cortex. And we've discussed how prefrontal cortex is the executive center of the brain. It's implied in decision making and thinking, critical thinking as well. And the second important aspect is the socio emotional system, which, as the name suggests, is more emotional and socially oriented. Also, the limbic system, again, the limbic system, the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, there are a few areas associated with this system. And we've already discussed how amygdala, for instance, is the emotional brain, it's the emotional center of the brain. The limbic system is the emotional center of the brain and is implied in the processing of emotions. So, how when we emotionally react, it's the limbic system essentially which is reacting in behavior. Now, essentially, why adolescents are prone to some kind of deviant behavior is because of the differential development of the cognitive control system and the socio emotional system. So the socio-emotional system develops at around 12, 13 years of age, which is the onset of adolescence. It also develops rapidly and quickly. So when it begins to develop around 12, 13 years of age, and that's where the development also reaches the peak, right? So it develops rapidly. And this system, the socio-emotional system, is responsible for risk taking in an individual, is responsible for increase in impulsivity, is responsible for sensation seeking, for the susceptibility to peer pressure that an individual has. So, also, if you notice in adolescence, all of these traits usually are high. Adolescents are high on risk taking, they are high on impulsivity, they are high on sensation seeking, they are also extremely susceptible to peer pressure. Um, Also, then social emotional system is also associated with delinquent behavior in turn. So as we've discussed earlier as well, that risk taking and sensation seeking can be manifested in say for instance drinking and driving, right? So drinking and speeding through the road is one of the ways in which sensation seeking and risk taking can manifest itself. Addictions, drug addiction, alcoholism, all of these are sensation seeking activities. Also, peer pressure, the need to be accepted in the peer group. So, for instance, if you're engaging with drugs, then I'd also want to do it. Why? Because that makes me feel more accepted in my peer group. So, susceptibility to peer pressure is also high around this time. The socio emotional system develops around 13 years of age and also peaks around that age. The cognitive control system, on the other hand, begins to develop at around 16 to 17 years of age. So the development of the cognitive control mechanism is delayed. It develops late in an individual. Also, it develops gradually. So in contrast to socio-emotional system developing quickly, the cognitive control system develops gradually. So it begins to develop around 16, 17 years of age, and its development may continue till around 23, 24, even 25 years of age, right? Now, this cognitive control mechanism, as the name suggests, is responsible for self-regulation and control of behavior. And it is also associated with socially congenial behavior patterns in an individual. So, for instance, the fact that I can behave in a socially congenial manner, it's because I can regulate and control my behavior socially, because my cognitive control system is well developed, and that enables me to regulate and control my behavior, which is not adequately present, is not adequately developed in 12, 13, 14-year olds, right? So during early adolescence. So if we look at the relative strength of the socio-emotional system and the cognitive control mechanism, it looks something like this. The blue line here is the cognitive control mechanism, whereas the red line here is a socio-emotional system. And if you notice, the socio-emotional system is developing, but takes a peak, develops significantly around 13, 14 years, and its development is at its peak, or its strength, as far as its manifestation in our behavior is concerned. It sort of is around its peak around 16, 17 years of age, right? So all through adolescent years, 14 to about 17, 18 years, it is manifesting with a lot of strength in our behavior. Also, the cognitive control system, by contrast, develops gradually. So it does gradually increase in its strength in our behavior, but develops to a sufficient strength only around 18, 19 years of age. So once an individual enters adulthood, and in fact is able to reach the intensity uh, of the socio control, matching the socio emotional system, only by about 21, 22 years of age, and of course supersedes it, surpasses it after that, right? So what we're essentially saying is that around 16, 17 years of age, it is the socio emotional system which is governing our behavior, whereas the cognitive control mechanism, and like I said, both of these are very neurological. So in terms of neurological development, the cognitive control mechanism is able to regulate and govern our behavior only by around 22, 23 years of age. Also, in terms of impulse control and sensation seeking, so the social emotional system, which is responsible for sensation seeking. So consider how sensation seeking uh, begins to increase around 12, 13 years of age, and sort of reaches its peak around 15, 16 years of age. uh, and then of course gradually begins to decline, because the importance or the strength of the socio emotional system begins to decline after that. Whereas impulse control, which enables us to control our impulses, to regulate and govern and monitor our behavior, impulse control is pretty low around 12, 13 years of age. It gradually increases, and then again surpasses sensation seeking at around the onset of adulthood, which is around 18, 19 years of age. So again, and then eventually impulse control in adults becomes the primary regulator of behavior. So it grows and continues to grow and peaks at around 20, 23 years of age, 22 to 23 years of age, right? So what we're essentially saying is, at a neurological level, essentially adolescents are extremely prone to sensation seeking, and they lack impulse control, wherein in the natural course of neurological development, once they enter adulthood, uh, the sensation seeking would decline and the impulse control will increase in congruence with the development of certain brain parts of the individual, and therefore offending patterns or deviant behaviors remain limited to the adolescent years, and they take a backseat once adulthood sets in. Now that gets us to an important differentiation between intellectual maturity and psychosocial maturity. Now, maturity should not be considered as a unitary concept, but it's multifaceted, and specifically, intellectual and psychosocial maturity are two important different aspects of maturity. Now, by intellectual maturity, I simply imply the ability to reason and understand. uh, so, for instance, if we're saying that in a 16-year-old, the socio-emotional system is governing the behavior of this individual, then we're not essentially implying that the individual, the 16-year-old, is not mature. This individual perhaps might be as intellectually mature as any adult, but this individual is lacking psychosocial maturity, by which I mean that at around 16, 17 years of age, the ability to reason out, the ability to engage with someone verbally and non-verbally, the ability of a 16-year-old is perhaps at par with that of an adult. So adults are no better at perceiving risks or estimating their vulnerability or even understanding the consequences of their behavior than 16, 15, 16-year-olds, right? So 16-year-old does understand that an act can be dangerous, or the fact that I should not engage in that act. But that idea is that understanding that I should not engage in a particular act is different from actually not engaging oneself and not actually not engaging in that act, right? So, and that is where psychosocial maturity plays an important role. So I might understand that my act has negative consequences, but despite that understanding, and I would understand that because I'm intellectually mature, but despite that understanding, I would still not be able to stop myself from engaging in that act. Why? Because my cognitive control mechanism has not yet developed. My behavior regulation has not adequately developed. And therefore, despite that intellectual understanding that an act is dangerous, I might still not be able to stop myself from engaging in that act. And that is because I'm not psychosocially mature yet, right? And this inability to restrict one's behavior or regulate one's behavior, which begins to develop at adulthood and the development continues till about 23, 24, even 25 years of age, this psychosocial immaturity becomes even more important in defining criminal behavior in certain situations. Situations like, for instance, when adolescents are emotionally aroused, when adult supervision is missing, when there are no adults to regulate or monitor the behavior of an adolescent or a 15, 16-year-old, when an adolescent is faced with a choice between an immediate reward or a delayed punishment, right? So that again brings us back to our concepts of operant conditioning: immediate show short rewards versus delayed uncertain punishment. Which would you choose? And because adolescents are high on impulsivity, they are more likely to fall for immediate rewards. So again, in these conditions, the psychosocial immaturity is more likely to manifest itself, which is why a lot of deviant adolescent criminality or delinquency is associated with such situations where adults were not there, adolescents were extremely emotionally aroused, they were angered, or they were drunk. So again, they could not control their behavior. So basically the point here that I want to have is that emotional maturity should not be confused with psychosocial maturity. Even though I might have an understanding that my act is bad and has negative consequences, I might still not be able to stop myself from engaging in that behavior. Why? Because even though I'm intellectually mature, I'm still not psychosocially mature, because my cognitive control mechanism has not developed yet to ensure adequate regulation or monitoring or control of my behavior. Now with that, of course, the key issue that we want to address, whether retribution or rehabilitation for juveniles, which is a better strategy. Now of course, like I said, that the law that we have currently provides for 16 to 18-year-olds to be tried as adults in a regular criminal court, and that to a very large extent also associates with the idea of punishing an individual for the crime that the person has committed. So retribution as an ideology is at work here, and from a psychological standpoint, of course, this is the line in which this provision of the JJ Act has been evaluated. So from a psychological standpoint, retribution is largely a failed ideology. wherein we of course have laws in place, so many laws in place, but they fail to have the effect which they are supposed to have. um, and of course, from the standpoint of deterrence as well, they fail to deter behavior. So for instance, the idea of tax evasion, and we've discussed that in class as well. We have a law in place, but that doesn't stop us. The fear of punishment doesn't stop us from engaging in evading taxes. Why? Because again, we'll go back to our concepts of operant conditioning. Definite, sure shot, immediate rewards versus delayed uncertain punishment. So if I'm evading tax, then I'm definitely saving money immediately, versus if I'm caught and I'm punished, processed by the law, caught, punished, it would take a long time, if at all it happens. So very uncertain punishment and extremely delayed punishment then fails to have the desired effect. Also, in terms of uh, the impact of punishment, um, or the fear of punishment stopping people from engaging in criminal behavior. So that idea has also been dismissed, wherein a lot of studies show us that uh, the more extreme the punishment is, the more severe the punishment is, the more likely it is to actually lead to an increase in criminal behavior. So, for example, capital punishment might increase rates of violent crimes in a state. One reason for that is, of course, modeling, which is observing the behavior of the state. The state is executing someone. If the state can kill, therefore I can also kill. So observational learning through observing the state engage in killing. And of course, the uh, state, when the state kills, the state is seen as justifying killing, and that in turn diminishes the respect for human life. So that's another line of debate which has been offered. So state justifying killing, and therefore if the state can kill, I can also kill. So retribution and deterrence, for instance, have been known to be failed ideologies in the field of psychology, and therefore why use that ideology, uh, why apply that to the field of juvenile justice? Also, another line of debate is that if the age of criminal responsibility can be lowered, then why should the age of marriage or voting be constant? So, if we're saying that a 16-year-old is responsible enough to and accountable enough as far as his criminal behavior is concerned, so if he can hold accountability for his criminal behavior, then of course he's responsible enough to, get married, have, uh, successfully execute the responsibilities of a married life, and also take absolutely informed, responsible decisions as far as one's voting is concerned. So, if we are lowering the age of criminal responsibility, then perhaps logically the age of marriage and voting can also be lowered. So, why should that be, held at 18 years? So, that's another line of argumentation within psychology, which has to do with uh, a lot of debating around decision making abilities of an individual, critical appraisal, intellectual reasoning of an individual, the ability to analyze on the basis of facts, rational appraisal of situations. So, a lot of those areas of psychology are involved within that debate. And of course, juvenile justice must definitely be based on the foundation of rehabilitation, and which is what most researchers in psychology are telling us, that most juveniles belong to a deprived socioeconomic background. So, when we look into what goes into making a delinquent or a criminal, then we cannot ignore the role of the sociocultural environment of an individual. So, barring, of course, a very small group of individuals who are more likely to belong to the life course persistent trajectory, will probably continue in their deviant ways if they are not identified early on in life, and intervention offered early on in life. Barring those individuals, the majority of the individuals are actually taking the adolescent limited offending trajectory. And keeping that in mind, the offending patterns are directly in proportion with the socio-economic environment of that individual. So the offending patterns of adolescent limited offenders is are directly in proportion with the socio-economic conditions of this individual, right? So considering that most individuals, most juvenile offenders actually belong to the adolescent limited offending patterns, then perhaps what's desirable here is to give these individuals a congenial environment, um, in which these individuals can develop, can learn more pro-social behavioral patterns, can learn to develop warm and secure relationships, can learn to negotiate in a pro-social manner, and solve conflicts in a more pro-social manner. Therefore, what's more desirable is to give these individuals a more congenial environment to develop in. And of course, the underlying fundamental idea is that if a congenial environment is given to an adolescent limited offender, and again, most individuals, most juvenile delinquents belong to the adolescent limited offending patterns, then considering that if a congenial environment is given to this person, then the person naturally will fall back into more pro-social ways, rather than punishing this individual for what the person has done, which is perhaps more likely to be more detrimental for the future development of this individual, and perhaps is more likely to ensure the development of a persistent adult criminal, even if this person was not a persistent adult criminal, even if this person was more likely to return back to normal pro-social ways. So introducing a provision where a juvenile can be tried as an adult is a violation of the basic human right of a child, from not just a legal standpoint, but also from a psychological, neuropsychological, and a psychosocial standpoint. And therefore in psychology there is a very strong advocacy in support of trying anybody below 18 years of age as a juvenile and not as an adult, irrespective of the nature and the severity of the crime which is committed by this individual. So that was from me. And of course, if you have any other questions, we could discuss that at any point later. Thank you so much.